Well, hello, welcome to the video. This one's about the 10 British UK pub rock acts that changed music forever. Yes, they did. And it's a different sort of format to normal. I've done videos about most of these bands already, so if you want to check them out, do a search in YouTube. If I've not done it yet, I'll probably do it over the next couple of weeks. So let's get started with the obvious ones. Dr. Feelgood. You couldn't do something like this without mentioning Dr. Feelgood. And I'm not going to go on and on about Dr. Feelgood because I've mentioned them at great length. In a nutshell, they basically added excitement into R&B pub rock because there were lots of bands at the time who were playing that type of music, that blues-inspired R&B, you know, Chicago rocky blues, even though it was all quite new then because like the only access most of these musicians had was listening to imported records, which are hard to get because the radio hardly ever covered things like that. There's a guy called Mike Raven, I seem to recall, on BBC Radio 1 who used to do soul and R&B, but he was only on for about an hour a week, and he specialised in people like Curtis Mayfield and Isaac Hayes and things like that.
It's 7 o'clock on a Sunday night. My name is Mike Raven, and this is my R&B show. Watch out, here we go!
And that was about it. Nobody else on the radio played that sort of music. John Peel occasionally played something like that, and there's a guy called Pete Drummond, but on the whole, you wouldn't hear it. So when Dr. Feelgood came along, they were a breath of fresh air because no one else was doing the same sort of thing that they were doing. But they were the first of a long line. As I'll mention later on in this video, several of the 10 sort of like took this bluesy R&B and added a punch, added excitement. And I spoke to Wilko Johnson because I worked with Wilko after Dr. Feelgood days because he was sacked in 1976. Basically, he said that the whole way that he and Lee Brilleaux, the lead singer, Wilko was very fond of, shall we say, illicit substances, and so was Lee. And basically, when they got on stage, they were often out of their heads, and with the driving beat, because like there was the big figure on the drums and the bass lines, that was a solid beat, and Wilko and Lee could work their magic over it, because Wilko never had any formal training to learn to play the guitar. He thought he'd learned to play the Mick Green style, but when he later met Mick Green, he found out that they played in totally different styles, though the results were pretty much the same. So that's Dr. Phil got away, and another one we've got to get away quite quickly is Mickey Jupp. Now, Mickey Jupp had a huge influence on the pub rock scene. He was seen as the elder statesman, especially in the South End and the Canby Island. Was, amongst other things, he was like the guy in the record shop where all the musicians went to the record shop and asked his advice and which guitars should I buy, or drums or bass or whatever. And he was the guy. He'd been in a band called Legend, who were truly legendary. And Mickey Jupp, as far as I'm concerned, is one of the great geniuses, and he will not go along with this because he's a very modest man. But I think even Mickey knows that he's pretty special when it comes to the pub rock thing, and he had a huge influence on bands, and his own style was like pushing the boundaries all the time. It was like, I don't know, his wordplay was very clever.
Baby, I'm a taxi driver. I can cut you up or down.
It was something you didn't normally get. It was like, looking back on pub rock now, people say, oh, pub rock was this and that. It was very ordinary and down market. It wasn't. You had some exceptional bands in there. And there's bands I'm not even going to mention today, which I should maybe mention. Bands like Burlesque, which is basically Billy Jenkins and Ian Trimmer. And they had fantastic music, fantastic lyrics. Anyway, so that's Mickey Jupp. That's number 2. Who's number 3 then? Well, I'm going to say Nick Lowe. Because Nick Lowe, again, had a huge influence. Partly as, well, first of all, as a member of Brinsley Schwarz, which is the band he was, I suppose, the leader of, even though Brinsley Schwarz was the guy who was actually in Brinsley Schwarz, if you see what I mean. But Nick Lowe was the creative force. And surprisingly, people don't realise this, he actually left Brinsley Schwarz in 1975, and he joined Dave Edmunds' Rockpile. The next few years, I think they only did one album as Rockpile, but they did several albums. Nick Lowe and Dave Edmunds are both signed to different record labels. So when they did get an album, there was always a struggle with both the record labels. So what happened was, when they did an album, say, it would come out as a Nick Lowe album or it would come out as a Dave Edmunds album, even though it was the same members of Rockpile who were playing on both albums, if you see what I mean. So it's all very strange. But Nick Lowe also had a huge influence as a producer, the house producer when Stiff Records started. Of course, people will know, because we are very knowledgeable on this group, aren't we? We all know that Stiff Records started with a loan of £400 from Lee Brilleaux of the aforementioned Dr. Feelgood, and Nick Lowe was the producer. In fact, the first record that was put out on Stiff Records was the So It Goes single by Nick Lowe. And he produced the first UK punk single, an album, which was The Damned. New Rose was the single, the album was Damned, Damned, Damned. Again, Nick Lowe produced Elvis Costello, and I think you've got a lot of Elvis Costello's amazing sound at that time, which really was different and, again, exciting, was down to Nick Lowe's production, because I saw Elvis Costello in his, I think his band called Flip, wasn't it? Basically, I can't remember now. He had a band, and I saw them, and I saw very early years of Elvis Costello, I think at the Nashville. It was slightly disappointing, but then when I heard the records, like Watching the Detectives and I Don't Want to Go to Chelsea,
There's no place yet, but I'm gonna skirt a while. Gabba Duck, gonna spit, choose last, choose a model. They call her a dasher when she looks like Elsa.
the sound was just amazing, and eventually they recreated that on stage, and so that's thanks to Nick Lowe. And of course he wrote loads of songs which lots of people, from Johnny Cash and Elvis Costello, and everybody has re-recorded, and he's recorded them. And if you get a chance to listen to his stuff now, it's very good. It's not like the same. Obviously he's one of those guys who wants to keep evolving. So Nick Lowe's stuff now, over the last 10 or 20 years, is totally different to his stuff in the 1970s and 80s, but it's still very, very good, and I suggest you check it out. And who is the next person? Well, the next one is the Count Bishops. Well, actually, I'll come to Count Bishops in a moment, because you can't really have the Count Bishops. We can, because there were two bands at the time. There was Eddie and the Hot Rods and the Count Bishops, who took what Dr. Feelgood had done and they created almost a proto-punk, because like the Count Bishops were one of the most exciting live bands. They did what Dr. Feelgood did with the blues and R&B, and they put it in a slightly different way, so it sounded different. It was much more punky than Dr. Feelgood. Dr. Feelgood, even though they were like very influential in a punk thing, they still sounded vaguely R&B and blues, whereas the Count Bishops, at their best, like I Love Candy and things like that, it is punk, basically, and it was before punk and it went after punk and it developed over the thing. And unfortunately, the guitarist died, I think I can't remember, it's 78, I think, something like that, in a car crash. And unfortunately, that was the end of the band. But they reformed, and in the early part of this century, I think 2003, something like that, and I put them on at the 100 Club, which is obviously not the exact band that it was then. And they were the key members, I think, apart from obviously the people who were dead or had moved away. And they were fantastic. Unfortunately, back then, before they were just about to make it big, they were getting things. I think they had a drummer from Australia who got deported, and they had lots of things like that happen, and such bad luck, but they still kept on, and they were on Chiswick Records. But there you go, that's the Count Bishops. And the other one I mentioned, obviously Eddie and the Hot Rods. They, again, coming from Canvey Island, Barry Masters and the band. A lot of these bands I'm talking about interchanged members. Like, for example, they were the same at the pub rock game. When I was putting on bands at the Cricketers and elsewhere, often you wouldn't know who would be in the band. There'd obviously be the key personnel, but like people that come and go all the time, and they'd actually what they called dep in. They would fill in for somebody. And Eddie and the Hot Rods and the Kersal Flyers had like a lot of similar members, and Wilko Johnson, his early band, the Solid Senders. Eddie and the Hot Rods sort of like took the R&B of Dr. Feelgood, the excitement, and they made it more punk without being quite as R&B and blues based still as the Count Bishops. But they were, I would say, if you've got to pick a band who were the archetypal first band, punk band on the London circuit, it'd have to be Eddie and the Hot Rods. And then the 101ers, which is my next band, which obviously is the band that Joe Strummer was in. They were never as punky as people reckon they were. Their singles were more punky than they were live. Even though Joe Strummer was in the 101ers, they were part of the Ladbroke Grove, sort of Notting Hill Gate hippie set. There was the odd flash of excitement on stage, but it was more country sort of thing than you would expect. And that's obviously why Joe Strummer left. He was obviously the charismatic frontman of the band, although I don't think that he was considered the leader by the other members of the band. I'm pretty sure they lived in squats in Elgin Avenue and like around there, as did lots of band members and people I knew. So it was a big thing. There was like a whole street basically who'd been empty and been squatted, and the whole street had like people that you would recognise today living in those houses, and it was pretty squalid actually. You don't want to go there. The toilets were on the whole, I'm not saying all of them, but eventually what happened was people who were in there like took charge of things and started cleaning things. But when it first started, it was pretty gruesome, and the 101ers were part of that. So of course they were doomed to failure because Joe Strummer was never going to stay in that band. He was always, I mean, no matter what people think about Joe, he was an ambitious man. His name wasn't even Joe, obviously. He was another one of these guys like Mick Lowe, essentially, who was a public school boy who did everything he could to try and disguise his middle-class origins, because back then the whole 1970s thing was like disguising your middle-class ambitions. But there were bands, I mean, the Global Village Trucking Company, which was a band, they all lived in a commune. All the members of the band were like sons of the aristocracy and went to public schools and things. So it was a bit of a sham, but at the same time it was a nice sham because they were very nice and they all acted very nice. And I used to know Jeremy LaSalle's, who was the Honourables, and he was the son of Earl Harwood, who was like the Queen's cousin. But you wouldn't know by speaking to him. But I think now he's him or his brother who's actually inherited the title. I don't know. Somebody has anyway. But so anyway, let's go on to the next one. Who's the next band who... Well, hang on, before we get there, can I just say, if you like this, please like. You know what to do. Subscribe. If you're not already subscribed, that helps you and me. It helps YouTube give you more things like this, if this is what you like. And share it with your friends. Let's make our community even bigger, can we? We are growing, and I do appreciate all your comments. I do try and answer every single one. I can't answer supplementary ones often because I don't get notified of them, if you know what I mean, by YouTube. But anyway, let's not talk about me. Let's go on to the next band. Well, the next band we're going to do about is really Sean Tyla. I was going to say Dux Deluxe, because Sean Tyla was a guy who basically formed Dux Deluxe, and it was like one of the archetypal pub rock bands. And for some reason, I've not done a proper video about Dux Deluxe or his subsequent bands, including the Tyla Gang. But I'll do a Dux Deluxe, I do promise. But in the meantime, they were one of the like rockier end of the pub rock things. I think it started in 72, and they were really good. But by 75, they'd run out of steam, and I can't remember why they stopped. There was a reason why they stopped, and I can't remember what it was. But basically, Sean Tyla immediately formed the Tyla Gang.
You got styrofoam ceiling, styrofoam floor. You got styrofoam windows, styrofoam door.
There's a band from Wales I used to be involved with called Man, who were a psychedelic-ish. I mean, it's fair art to pigeonhole these bands. They were pretty clever. Their music was pretty clever. They were partly avant-garde. They would fit in the same sort of category as Captain Beefheart and the Magic Band without being quite as, avant-garde, if you know what I mean. They were more of a grassroots rock band. They came from the Welsh valleys, and Sean Tyla was involved with various members of the band. He was in a band called Help Yourself, first of all, and that sort of like included a couple of people who were from Man and various other bands. And eventually, after the Tyla Gang, with a band called, what they called, The Force, I think they were called, with Leonard. Deke was a very good friend of mine. He wrote a few books about the rock and roll industry from the point of view of Man, the band Man touring. I think Winos was one of them. That's just part of the title. I will put the title up. But they were very good books. if you get a chance to read them, please do so. And they can tell you more about that era than I can, because Deke obviously was living the whole pub rock band ethos from the time he got to bed to the time he went to bed, every day, 7 days a week. He stayed living in West Wales in Llanelli, and I think he died there actually. And I used to pass through there going to see my parents, because they lived in Pembrokeshire, a place called Narberth. And so I would pass through on the train quite often. And I once saw Deke on the platform. And we looked at each other. This is probably, God knows how many years ago now, 30 years ago. And we looked at each other, and it took and we thought, oh, I know him, sort of thing. And it took a while to register. When we did, it's like, and the train was gone. So anyway, you don't know about this, do you? Anyway, Tyla Gang, yes. And unfortunately, Sean, I think it was in the Dingwalls in 1983, could have been 82. They were on stage this was with The Force, actually, thinking about it, because the Tyla Gang developed into The Force with Deke, Leonard. And on stage with The Force, apparently just part way through the set, Sean whispered in Deke's ear something that Deke didn't quite catch, and they finished the gig without him. So when he went in, apparently he had stage fright, and for about 20 years he couldn't go on a stage. But he did come back, actually. The early part of this century, he's since unfortunately passed away. So R.I.P. Sean, who was again one of the top musicians in the pub rock thing, who changed basically music as we know it today. And who's the next one? Well, the Pogues, actually. I know this is a bit later in the pub rock ethos, but I think I must have said several times how I came across the Pogues. Basically, they were busking at Hammersmith, and I enjoyed what I saw, and I went to see them at a gig, I think funny enough, at the Clarendon, downstairs at the Clarendon, and it was packed, and they were really good. They were doing a punk version of Irish folk, because I had a lot of friends like Malcolm and Joe from the Roby and the Weavers, who were in Irish traditional bands, if you like, that played on the Irish circuit. So I could go and see them occasionally, and we put on acts together. We'd bring over the big acts from Ireland, like the Fury Brothers, featuring Davey Arthur and people like that, and we'd put them on at Irish centres or Battersea Arts Centre and things like that. And we do quite well out of it. That was what we used to do. And I don't think I mentioned that, but that's a little sideline we used to have where we used to do that. So I was quite involved with the Irish thing. But the Pogues were like, it was that with a punk slant to it, and obviously Shane was like a total one-off. Although Shane actually is a bit sad, because although he's a very talented man, I think he's probably too talented, because I remember seeing him first in the Nips. Well, first time seeing him, he used to be at every gig in the punk era. Practically every gig he'd be at the front, and he'd be out of his head from the time the doors opened till the time he collapsed normally. And then he was in a band called the Nips with Shan, who came the bassist in the Men They Couldn't Hang, who was made up mainly of Cush and Swillow, who I think were Pogues roadies at the time. So they formed the band as they were watching the Pogues develop, and they had their own band, and they did lots of supports, and I put them on loads of times. I tried to be their manager. Long story, tried to be the Pogues manager too, but I wasn't. So I basically put them on, because I don't think I was at the Cricketers at this stage. I put them on at the Roby. I think I did Tuesday nights at the Roby. I think it's either Tuesday or Wednesday. Whichever it is, I think it was one, and all the records say it was the other. I'm pretty sure it was Tuesday, so it was probably Wednesday. So you just can't trust your memory. And it was absolutely amazing. The first one was quite full, but then as it went on, it became, well, the final straw was when when I think something like 2,000 people turned up or something like that, and they couldn't get in the pub. I mean, and the whole of the street, there's a main road that went past the front door of the Roby between there and the Rainbow, or the Finsbury Park Astoria, or what it was called afterwards when it was a church, and that whole road was blocked, and the police came, and they basically said, you've got to stop doing this, because we can't have the road blocked every Tuesday/Wednesday. So that was that, and I put them on upstairs at the Clarendon, and that was like with the Men They Couldn't Hang and the Boot Hill Foot Tappers and people like that. Because again, it's all, everybody knew everyone else. Like Shan, who was the bass player, went out for a while with Reckless Eric Goulden, who I was agent for at the time, and that was a very tumultuous time for everybody. I can remember an incident in the shipping Wardour Street where beer were beer glasses and beer was flying all over the place. And oh yes, those are the days, aren't they? And thank God I'm over all that now. I'm a bit old for that kind of thing now. But there you go, this was back in the 1980s. So anyway, there you go. And the Pogues and I drifted apart, as you know. They went on. I saw them with Joe at Strummer, I think at the Town and Country Club or the Electric Ballroom, something like that, where they tried out various vocalists when Shane left or became too ill or whatever. I think he just left, and Joe at Strummer was one of them, and he was okay, but it wasn't really the Pogues for me. And I think eventually they took over the duties themselves. That was the Pogues, and who else? Well, you can't talk about pub rock and influential bands without talking about the Pirates. Now, the Pirates as the band, as opposed to Johnny Kidd and the Pirates, which is what they morphed out of once Johnny Kidd had moved on and then died. The Pirates is basically Mick Green, Frank Farley and Johnny Spence. They sort of doing things on the London pub circuit, I think in 1976. At the time, they were like one of the, I don't know, it was like, it started off as being a bit of a tributey thing, because don't forget, this is 1976 and punk is going on all around. But somehow, even though these guys aren't exactly spring chickens even back then, the punks take a shine to them. They were so loud and they were so aggressive on stage, and they only did short sets. People actually forget this. I think that if you got 40 minutes out of them, you were doing it well, because they basically just went for it. They were never easy to get on with. I mean, Mick Green was a bit of an Arthur Daly type, was Mick, and basically if he got a better offer, he'd go and do the better offer. And because he was like the guitarist in later years for people like Brian Ferry and Van Morrison, you often had a situation where he couldn't play, and of course the Pirates without Mick Green was not really the Pirates, and so you'd have the choice whether to do it with a depth guitarist. I think one of the guys was Johnny Guitar from the Count Bishops actually once. When I was doing shows, I used to hate disappointing the audience. And you will notice that I've only done 9 acts. Well, I've probably mentioned about 40, but I think I'm deliberately going to leave it like that, because let's say the one I haven't mentioned is the one that you think I ought to mention. Let's leave it at that. And if you comment down below and let me know what you think the 10th act ought to have been, that would be great. And thank you very much for watching, and see you next time. Watch this one next if you like. Goodbye.